All right, so let's go ahead and dive right into doing some code, okay? So I'm assuming this is all of your first time doing any kind of code. Maybe you did it a long time ago. Maybe you did some very minor coding in a class or something. But let's just kind of assume this is your first time, okay? So I'm going to take this very slow. We're going to go over things from a very base level. We're going to take this from an angle of very simple, starting from scratch, okay? So our first step is to create the script we're going to use. Now, a script is just a piece of code that we're going to apply to an object to give it some kind of new functionality, to give it some kind of capability. So what we're going to do, this is going to be an asset. So remember, assets are created as files on our computer. They're created here through the project window. So we're going to hit create, and we're going to be using C#. Okay. Now, JavaScript was pretty popular for a while with Unity. It's still pretty popular for a lot of web development. I personally would suggest that you stray away from JavaScript. It's really hard to explain without getting into a lot of the details, but it's better in the long run if you get used to C#. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and create a C# script, and I want you to just leave the name, the default new behavior script. Let's just leave that how it is. It's totally fine. Just click off it. Okay, so now this is an asset. And again, I can show you here. It just created a file on our computer. Okay, right there. So what I want you to do is double click this. Now, it's going to take a little bit depending on which program you're using. You're either going to be using Visual Studio or MonoDevelop by default. If you're on an older version, it's probably going to default to MonoDevelop. I am using Visual Studio. I do suggest Visual Studio because I've had a lot of issues with MonoDevelop crashing and just give me a lot of weird errors and issues and things. So I do suggest Visual Studio. It's a lot more stable. It does tend to be a little slower to start up the first time, but once you're in, everything's okay. So your theme might look a little bit different. It might not be dark like this. It might be a brighter theme. You can change all that stuff. That's something you could look up on your own and figure out what you want to do. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. Okay, now I know what's going through a lot of your head. You're looking at this and you're kind of freaking out a little bit. Maybe you're hyperventilating a little bit. Maybe you're having a panic attack. You know, I understand this is scary, and I don't blame you. Looking at this, it's very intimidating. There's so many things going on. There's symbols everywhere. There's just words. It's a big mess, right? So I always ask myself this, and I ask my students this: why are people scared of programming? And I think it really just comes from a place of just being intimidated and thinking you're not good enough to do it, or thinking that if you don't immediately understand it, that you're never going to understand it. And that's not a good mindset to get in. You know, you want to tackle new challenges and be like, you know, this is new, but I'm going to figure this out. You know, I'm going to conquer this and figure it out. And once you do, you're going to realize it wasn't so bad, right? I'm just going to kind of give you a tour of what a C# script looks like, okay? And what each part means. So this is its own section up here. This is our first section. Now this is where we keep what we call namespaces. Namespaces give the code more functionality. They give it the capability to do new things. So these are the ones in here by default, okay? If you were to take these out, you would get a lot of issues when you try to write the code that we're going to be doing. These cover a lot of the basics that you do in code. So these we basically don't touch, okay? This is its own section we're not going to touch. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to divide this off, and I'm going to do this for each new section, okay? So what I'm going to divide this off with is what we call a comment. Now, a comment is a very important thing in coding. You already see there's two of them in our code by default. There's one right here and one right here, okay? Now you might think these look kind of like English, right? These don't really look like code. They're not this complicated thing we see here, this thing here with all these sentences, symbols. This is an English sentence right here, right? You know what that means. So a comment is essentially a part of the code that the computer does not read and the computer just completely ignores, okay? And that's indicated by those two slashes. You also notice it's going to turn green. If you're in MonoDevelop, it's going to turn gray. So this says computer completely ignore what comes after these lines, okay? Now, what we use these for is kind of like for notes. If we're making notes for ourselves or for other programmers, you can use it to kind of give yourself headers for certain sections, say this is what this section does. Now, comments are important. I want you to get in the habit of using them. Use them very thoroughly at first, and eventually you can kind of learn to summarize things a little better and cut down on your comments. but you always want to be doing comments. And even if you're not working on a team, it's helpful just for yourself, because me, I have a horrible memory. So if I come back and look at something I coded a week ago, I have no idea what it is. It takes me a while to really read through it and figure out what it was. So I have to leave comments for myself, right? And it's especially important if you're working on a team, because you want them to be able to look at a big block of code, hundreds of lines of code, and summarize it in one simple sentence, right? Save them time from looking through it, makes everything more efficient. So you can go ahead and give yourself these header sections. I'm just going to say header section we'll say namespaces go here, namespaces give new functionality. Okay, and then what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do a comment, but I'm going to do a comment with a bunch of lines, okay? Just a bunch of dashes. And this is just going to kind of a visual thing for me to just kind of cut off this section, say this is a different section. If you want, you can even come up here and do this, put it like that. Okay, so that's one section right there. This is something, again, you don't need to worry about this. This is something we're going to use a lot later probably. Don't worry about it, don't touch it, ignore it, okay? Now, next we have this whole thing right here, okay? This is kind of the next big section. Now, this is the important part. This is where you're actually going to be doing your code and putting all your lines of code that you're going to write, okay? This right here, we can write a little comment for this. What this does, this is basically starting the code, okay? This is where the code really begins. This is where all the code that's functional is going to be in this space, okay? So we're just going to say and what I want you to do, I want you to write comments that make sense for you, okay? I don't want you to just copy verbatim what I'm writing. I want you to write how you are currently understanding this the best you can in your own words, okay? And that's going to help you memorize this stuff. Now, one thing that is very important in code, and I cannot stress this enough, with my students, I can tell you this is the one thing that I see the most really mess my students up, and it happens for, you know, past first semester. It's kind of a consistent problem. So I've come up with a lot of kind of rules of thumb for them to really hammer this down and help make sure they don't mess this up again. And this is the curly braces, okay? These are dreaded little monsters right here. See this right here? Now what these are a beginning and an end for something, okay? So when you see this curly brace right here, this is essentially saying I am starting this new behavior script, okay? Now you'll see this one down here. If I click these, see how the other one kind of highlights? And what you'll also see is this kind of lines up vertically, okay? It's lining up perfectly with that. There's even some dotted lines that kind of guide you visually in Visual Studio. So what you need to understand is that this right here is the closing brace for the entire class, okay? This is basically the whole script again. So it's basically saying this is the end of the script, all right? Now what's important about these is everything in between the beginning and the end brace is a part of that thing. So anything from here down to here, that is all part of the public class, okay? It's the beginning and the end. Now, what you'll also see, and these I'll explain in a second, you'll see there's also things within this class that also have their own sets of braces. You see that? And this is getting into embedding. This is getting to where we have layers upon layers upon layers of different things inside other things, essentially, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to write a comment here. So we're just going to do this. Now, I actually want you to start doing this for your code. This isn't just a demonstration thing. I want you to start doing this, okay? Because this is going to help you not mess up your placement of code, okay? So I'm putting this line right here, all right? I'm going to copy that. I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to put another one right above the very last closing brace, okay? And again, you can highlight it and check, yes, this is the one that's closing off the entire class, okay? The entire script. So I'm even going to put a little note right here, say, okay? Now, this thing, what you notice I did here, I put a comment to the right of this. This didn't turn green. It's still highlighted white. Okay, so what happens is you can put comments to the right of existing code, and it will still keep what's to the left of that as working code. But everything after this brace on this side of it, this is not working code. The code will ignore that, okay? So what we have kind of protected this brace, blocked it off, because a lot of students end up, and beginners end up deleting this brace or using it for something else, and they really kind of screw up their code that way, and it's hard to identify the problem when you've done that. So I want you to actually start doing this, okay? I even do this sometimes in my own code, and I've been coding for, over a decade. So this is just a protection to say, hey, don't go below this and don't go above this. Everything we're going to be doing is going to be within this space, okay? If you want to make a note of that, you can as well. So what we have here, you can see we have two separate little sections, okay? Again, I'm defining these sections as things that have an opening brace and a closing brace. So we have something called void start, all right? And we have something called void update. Now these are functions, okay? Now I'm going to go over functions in the next lesson, but just know that basically in C#, whenever you want to make a function, you're just going to call it void. So for now, you can just think of void as an equivalent synonym to function. There is a reason it's called void. It's really hard to explain without going into a lot of depth, so I don't want to overwhelm you. So we're just going to kind of accept the fact that void means function, okay? So we can even make a note of that. Okay. So like I said, we're going to go over functions in a little bit, but I just want to kind of get you comfortable with this layout. So again, I'll review this real quickly. This is a section we don't really touch. These are namespaces. This entire section down here, this is the class, aka the script itself. Everything we're going to do is going to be within the confines of these braces, okay? And these are two functions that are here by default, and we will mess with these. We'll make our own functions. So I hope this has kind of helped you to get a little more comfortable. Maybe it's not quite as scary now that you've kind of broken this down. And I'll tell you, the best thing you can do is really break down these things that are overwhelming to you. Take these things and say, okay, let me do this one thing at a time, break it down section by section, and we'll kind of be able to see how this works, okay? Now one important thing here as well is indentation. So you'll notice these void starts are kind of bumped over to the right a little bit. They're not aligned up with this left side, correct? So whenever something is within the braces of something else, you just indent it over one tab, okay? And we don't use spaces. We don't do that. We just hit tab, okay? And it does do some auto formatting by itself. It does that pretty much. It does it pretty well on its own, so you don't need to worry about that too much. But just know that when you indent something, it's saying, hey, this is within the confines of something else, right? Another thing is that visual space is important, especially when you're starting out. I have a lot of students who try to do stuff like this and just have everything back to back to back, no lines in between, right? This is a mistake because you're going to get confused, you're going to mess stuff up, you're going to get things melded together. You want to give yourself some visual space. Blank lines are totally fine to have in code. It's not going to hurt your code. Nothing wrong is going to happen. It's fine. Give yourself room to breathe. Give yourself a lot of empty visual space so you can look at this and break it down a lot easier with your eyes, okay? So that's going to be it for this one. The next time we will go over functions. We're going to cover them. We're going to explain them in a very simple way. You're going to be fine. Don't worry about it. So I'll see you then.